It's the season of giving, so where should you give? Should you give this man money?
Would you help out today, New York?
What about this man?
Thank you.
Actually, that's me. Don't give money to beggars like me.
Can you help me, ma'am?
I'm told governments must spend more.
Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, and Social Security will reduce poverty.
But does government really help the poor?
Yes, everybody in Cleveland, low minority, got Obama phone.
By any measurement, this isn't working.
I'm glad more people have figured that out. Even the singer Bono.
Commerce, entrepreneurial capitalism takes more people out of poverty than aid.
Even some in the mainstream media.
If you're waiting for the government, you're going to be in for an awful long wait.
Wow, if they get it, maybe soon more people will realize there are better ways to give.
There you go. Oh, beautiful.
Real charity. That's our show tonight.
And now, John Stossel.
What is real charity? When people are in trouble, say after disasters, or simply when people are poor, Americans' instinct is to think, how can government help? After all, who will help those people if not government? We libertarians argue that private charity would step in, individuals freely choosing to help. But would enough of us help? Most people say no. And that's why liberals, like Newsday columnist Ellis Hennigan, say when it comes to helping the needy, that's mostly government's job?
Well, listen, it would be great if people all reached into their hearts and solved all these horrible problems we have, but history teaches us that that doesn't happen. In almost every single case where there is a government program, it exists because the private efforts that you and I both admire weren't enough.
Well, it's because politicians said they weren't enough and we could do better, but I would argue that if government didn't take so much of our money, the private sector would take care of these problems.
Well, hold on a second, John. For instance, look at older Americans, right? They used to be the poorest sector of our society, and then something called Social Security came along, and Medicare came along, and now older people really do comparatively fairly well. Before food stamps, we had hungry kids spread all across America. Those numbers were cut dramatically by that, despite all the generous churches and nice people like the ones who approached you on the street and gave you a nickel.
These programs are trillions in debt. They're unsustainable.
Well, I mean, maybe we have to tweak them, but you can't throw away the idea. What is the reality that we need government in there, too?
Food stamps, a couple billionaires could fund that whole food stamp program by themselves. And a private charity would be better at saying who really needs the food help and who's scamming the system.
You know what? I'd love that. If you know a billionaire who wants to pay the entire expense of food stamps, I think we would welcome that.
They don't step in because your big fat government is there. And people say, oh, well, government does that.
You see, here's, I think, the reality in real life is that all these private efforts are really important. We're very generous people. We give a lot of money. But when the chips are really down, when the big thing happens, when the typhoon hits the Philippines, we love the Red Cross effort. But you know what? They don't have an aircraft carrier with Marines on board and rescue helicopters. The U.S. military does. I want them steaming toward the Philippines when that typhoon hits.
I don't know what's going to happen in the Philippines. In Haiti, our government promised billions of dollars. $1 billion of it hasn't gotten to the people in Haiti. The New York Times says they were going to build 15,000 homes. Latest target, fewer than 3,000.
Listen, if your argument is that government sometimes doesn't do a perfect job, and sometimes even does an awful job, I concede that.
I want to play a longer version of that clip I showed earlier. Two of my left-wing colleagues were talking about how, after a disaster, faith-based charities were better at disaster relief than FEMA.
There's FEMA, and then there's the faith-based FEMA.
If you're waiting for the government, you're going to be in for an awful long wait. So this is Harry Smith and Brian Williams talking about the government response after the tornado in Moore, Oklahoma in May, and how 30 churches banded together and helped much more quickly and did a better job than government. This happened at Katrina, too. FEMA was turning away Walmart's free water. Well, people were trying to get water, and FEMA was sending its water to the wrong place.
You're right. Listen, as you know, I'm a native of New Orleans, so I feel that one kind of personally. And you're right. There's some things that the privates do well. I mean, there were all those kids, wonderful young people who came down in church groups. They did some things much better than government. But there was still an awful lot of things that we needed government for. Remember how angry folks were when FEMA was slow to get there? No one said stay away. They said get here quicker.
And Walmart and private charities got there.
And you know what? And so maybe one of the things that the privates can do is be a little more nimble, a little quicker. But boy, if you're talking about rebuilding the Gulf South in America, I don't think you want the government to take a pass.
I do. Let's talk about the war on poverty. Lyndon Johnson said he would end poverty. So here's where the war began in America. It's the poverty rate. And sure enough, dropped sharply the first 5-7 years after that. But then it stopped improving. We taught people, government programs teach people to be dependent. And look what was happening before the war on poverty. Americans were lifting themselves out of poverty. Government continued the progress for 5 years and then stopped it.
We should have been more generous with these programs. We should have done the other things that government can do to help folks.
Oh, gosh. You don't think we teach? Government doesn't teach dependency?
No. Listen, I am not here saying government is perfect. Government has some bad things. It's clumsy. It's bureaucratic. It has some waste and corruption in it. I'm just saying that there are things it does really well and things the privates do really well. And the test is, hey, private folks, step up.
I think these graphs are the test. Look, can we put these up? The rise of food stamp use in America. Now, you would say this is because more people are hungry, the recession, but it goes up steadily. The two lines refer to, one is the number of people collecting and the other is the cost. We're teaching people to be passive.
I grant you that's something we want to avoid. But so what's the solution? Should we look at those hungry people and say we're going to take your food stamps away and just hope for the best? Hope the food pantry down the block
We should limit
in?
these programs and let the private sector step in. One more example is the rise of disability payments to people. Straight up. So you got fewer people doing manual labor, medicine is better, and more people are disabled?
John, I got to tell you, I'm with you on that.
Agreement on one thing. Well, you want to get rid of it? I'll play your own question back.
No, I don't want to get rid of it. I mean, I think that we could certainly look a lot more closely at some of those applications.
Let's cut it way back. There's a place near here called a job center, a government office supposedly to help people find jobs.
Okay.
I went there. People said, there are no jobs. I've looked for jobs. I have to get my welfare here. We then went around and within a couple hours found 40 job offers, 28 entry-level positions. One restaurant owner said, I'd hire a dozen people if people would just apply. How many could come with no experience?
I would probably take like 9. Probably take 9 and train them.
And at the welfare office, people told us there are no jobs.
No, there's plenty of jobs.
These government jobs offices encourage people to take welfare. I had somebody go and ask for help, see if they'd help her get a job, and they said, no, they just steered me toward welfare and food stamps.
Yeah, listen, again, it's much smarter to have programs that encourage people to work, that don't reward laziness, that are
But
effective.
they all do that.
Oh, I don't know.
Private charities know who needs a push and who needs help.
But the answer can't be to just cut it back, can it?
Yeah, I think cut it back and invite the private sector in. But we'll stop there. Ellis Hennigan, thank you. Now, I say private charities should replace government in this rich country, but what about the rest of the world? People assume global poverty is a problem that has to be addressed by governments giving out foreign aid, or maybe the UN. And the UN contradicts the title of my book by saying, yes, we governments working together can end poverty in just 2 years. Wow, 2 years. Of course, 50 years ago, Lyndon Johnson claimed his war on poverty would end poverty in America. The UN will do better. Ted Turner gave them $1 billion for this. And individual governments have squandered nearly $1 trillion in foreign aid trying to lift people out of poverty in Africa. And I say squandered because after they spent $1 trillion, per capita income in Africa went down. This may be because the foreign aid encourages dependency and because African kleptocrat governments steal much of the money. But what's the alternative? Well, Michael Fay says he has an answer. What's yours?
We're going straight to the poor. Cash transfers from you directly to them. No middleman, no leakage, no hidden cost.
So you have a charity, and you've raised about $6 million and just given 20-some thousand people cash, about $1,000 each?
That's exactly right. $1,000 for the household.
This, to me, sounds like a stupid idea. They'll just spend it, and then they won't have any.
You're not the only one. People think we're crazy. The truth is, there's been about a decade of research that shows the exact opposite. What are these people missing? A lot of them are missing the capital. We have the old expression, teach a man to fish. The truth is, in a lot of these places, they don't have fishing poles.
So you allow them to buy a fishing pole, or in this case, this may have been a guy who got a motorcycle and uses it for a taxi service.
Yep, this was a used motorcycle that he bought with cash and now provides taxi services.
And you give the people a cell phone with the money. Why is that?
Because that's the way we transfer the money. It's phone to phone. If they don't have a phone, they may not be able to get the money.
And then it's easier to check up on them and see what they do.
We can check, we call them, we talk to them regularly.
And people built metal roofs. That's
metal roofs.
One of the most popular things.
One of the most popular. There's no charity that's doing it. The poor decided to do it. Saves income, clean water, less malaria, etc. We didn't think of it, they did.
And before they had the metal roof, they had a thatched roof, and they spent...
It burns down, it falls, and they spend about $100 a year replacing these things.
And so instead, they can start a business. Another person had received training from another charity to be a welder.
Yep, and he was sitting there doing nothing. Sitting, doing nothing, because he didn't have welding equipment. Now he does.
And what makes you think this works?
Oh, we don't need to think. We've got a decade of evidence. We've done our own third-party evaluation of our program. We know income goes up, stress levels go down, hunger falls, and the list goes on.
You do another odd thing for a charity. None of your charity board members works full-time for your charity. Why is that?
Well, here's the great thing. If it's not working, John, I wouldn't need to lie to you right now to keep my job.
That you could be more honest evaluating it when it's not your full-time job.
That's
Some
exactly
charities delude themselves?
Well, I think people have passion, and often passion blinds evidence.
Well, I still have a hard time accepting that this could... I just criticized government programs because they don't teach people to take care of themselves. I guess giving cash once and knowing it won't keep coming is different.
It's one-time transformative, and it doesn't matter who does it. It matters what they do. Why buy a cow when the person is too old and too sick to take care of the cow? Let them make the choice. We shouldn't be making the choice for them.
I hope it works. I'm glad a lot of these experiments are going on. Thank you, Michael. If you'd like to keep this conversation going, please go to Facebook or Twitter and use that hashtag there, #RealCharity. Let people know what you think. Coming up, President Obama says the way to help poor people is to give them a free cell phone.
A phone is a lifeline that no one should have to live without. Reach Out Wireless has been authorized by the U.S. government to offer a free cell phone.
The government will pay for you to have a free cell phone with monthly minutes, no credit check, and no deposit required.
Yippee! A free cell phone. 250 free minutes. What a deal. This is to help poor people who need a lifeline. That's reasonable. Make a call in an emergency. This is a government program that began when Ronald Reagan was president. President Obama expanded it, of course, and bingo, in just 4 years, the cost tripled. And it'll continue to rise because people love their Obama phones.
You got Obama phone?
Yes, everybody in Cleveland, low minority, got Obama phone. Keep Obama in president, you know. He gave us a phone.
He gave you a phone?
Do more.
How did he give you a phone?
You sign up if you're on food stamps, you on Social Security, you got low income, you disability.
The more free stuff you get, the more you're eligible to get. But eligible, that assume someone actually checks to see if you're really needy. Do they even do that? Jillian K. Melcher, a reporter for the National Review, was curious. So what did you do?
I went to all of the welfare offices in Manhattan and a couple in Brooklyn for good measure, and I found out that there are people out there approaching you on the street saying, hey, do you have your free phone yet? Well, I'm not.
Outside the office.
Outside the office.
Private entrepreneur.
That's right. And I'm not on welfare. I told them that. I told them that I'd like to be on welfare. I think a lot of the people who pay for it would like to be. But that was enough. They ended up giving me not one, not two,
one.
3 free phones.
3 phone. The good news is that some places turned you down. They did check.
Yeah. They ended up catching that, well, first off, you're not supposed to have duplicate phones, which I've already broken that rule. But they're also supposed to check eligibility. I'm not eligible. And they also didn't catch, except for one time, that I had multiple applications in and had tried to work my way through the system again and again.
And an FCC audit checked this out. They found 41% of the recipients never demonstrated that they were eligible.
Yeah, that's about 6 million people. But I think what you really see here is the phone companies have a very perverse incentive to push as many phones out on the street as they can. They get $9.25 per customer per month for this program. The street vendors...
It's paid for, we should explain, out of your phone bill. If you bother to read the fine print, there's something called a universal service charge, and this was under Ronald Reagan. Make sure everybody had a phone line, universal service, and so $1 or $2 out of everybody's phone bill
goes to fund this program. And I think that most taxpayers don't know it. Before I had gone out and investigated this, I didn't know what that fee was at the bottom of my phone bill.
You don't want poor people to talk to their families?
The phone companies are the bad guys in this. This is a huge business for them. TracFone, which is owned by Carlos Slim, that's the Mexican billionaire, one of the richest people in the world. In 2011...
He may be the richest in the world.
Yeah, he and Bill Gates compete. But he got, in 2011 alone, $500 million from this program. So I think you see what's turned out to be welfare for the poor. It's actually corporate welfare, plain and simple.
And what about my obnoxious question? You don't want to help the poor talk to their family?
Well, I think maybe there would be justification for a landline, and that's what the program started out as. But I think any time that you've got perverse incentives for a company to go hand out phones combined with a very poor oversight, you've got to ask yourself, are you creating a situation in which fraud and abuse can just compound? And that's exactly what we have here.
And it shouldn't surprise anyone. Government charity is susceptible to fraud. The contractor's doing the work. No, it's government's money. It's no one's money. And the more they give out, the more they get to keep. They get a commission on each giveaway. The cell phone charity is small, just $2 billion. Is that small? $2 billion. Think about the hundreds of billions spent on Medicare, Medicaid. There's much more fraud there. People who run medical clinics in Florida were caught with all this stuff. One man alone spent $20 million on this, diamond jewelry, also horses, a fleet of luxury cars, one after the other, all of which he got because government paid millions for medical treatment that never happened. And government help is just extra susceptible to abuse.
And that's definitely what I found. I was surprised that I was able to get 3 of them in violation of pretty much every program rule. And if I can do it, being somebody who tells the truth and who's not looking to defraud the government, just imagine the people that are actually looking to abuse the program, how great their opportunity is.
And private companies get ripped off too, but they have more of an incentive to check. Mm-hmm. It's their own money.
Yeah, that's right. And Georgia's actually doing some reforms within the state to try to see if they can mess with that fundamental flawed incentive structure. They're going to start charging $5 for consumers for an Obama phone. If they have to pay $5 for it, they're less likely to go out and get about 3 or 4 different Obama phones that they don't need.
Thank you, Jillian. Coming up, better ways to help people. One of the richest people in the world is Warren Buffett. Is he cheap? He's one of many billionaires who until recently gave very little to charity. He used his money to try to make more money. He said he'd give it away when he died. His fellow billionaire, Ted Turner, told me Buffett was being cheap.
He should give some away now.
Turner had just made a big splash by giving $1 billion to the UN. And now he said he wanted to shame other rich people into giving more.
What he said is patently stupid.
That was businessman T.J. Rogers' answer to Turner's bragging about his UN gift.
What he should do is take his money and invest it. And he can't help people any other better way than to invest it and to have the companies and buildings and plants that are created with this investment create jobs and wealth and products for other people.
Really? Is it better if a moneymaker uses his money to make more rather than give to charity? I think so, and I threw that question back to Ted Turner.
If Bill Gates says, look, I'm good at making money. I serve
this is ridiculous.
people.
I mean, you know.
I tried to argue this with Ted Turner, but he wasn't buying it. Am I wrong in thinking that I'm happy if Bill Gates gives nothing to charity?
But wouldn't you be happier if he did? What are you?
But just hear me out.
Beating on me about? You're just another. This is why people don't like newsmen. I'm a newsman too. I know your dirty tricks.
Yes, all right.
There's nothing more to say. Goodbye. I'm walking off the set.
Since he didn't want to talk about it, let's take that same question to economist Ben Powell. He runs the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech. So, Ben?
I'm not bothered if they don't give more of it away. They make their money by making our lives better. So they are helping people by making a profit, and often that's the best way they can go about helping people.
And when they make a profit and they hire people, those jobs live on for years, and people use it to educate their kids and feed their family. There's a multiplier. These guys may not even be good at charity. We know they're good at making money. I think they should stick to what their specialty is.
It's not about their motives, John. It's about the results from it. When they're pursuing profits in the marketplace, it leads them to do the very things that we want them to do to benefit others. Now, of course, the real reason for this is them creating the products and services that make our lives better. But as a byproduct, they also create jobs that make other people better off. And this is often the best way that they can go about making society better. It's what's fundamentally responsible for the high standard of living that we enjoy in this country.
And yet, most of them, I would say, don't feel good about all the wealth they create in their business, and they guiltily give charity, talk about giving back. I mean, even Bill Gates, who's now working full-time on charity, he's done so much to make our lives better with his company and his charity. He says he thinks most charity has to come from government.
A lot of the money that is supporting these causes is coming from the private sector, from people like you, and less from governments.
No, governments are the backbone of this.
No. Bill Gates has it all wrong. He's good at computers. He's not good at social policy. Just last week, I had a research paper presented in my seminar series here about the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And what happened afterwards, there was no FEMA to rush in and botch things. Instead, it was private charity and civil society organizations that banded together and helped get people out of the city who lost their homes, who brought in new shelter for them, who brought in clothing. And judging from what I was hearing in that research, it worked a heck of a lot better than when we get FEMA in there ordering people where they can and can't go and botching the whole process.
A recent edition of Forbes magazine, their richest people list, features big philanthropy. So they're now rating billionaires by how much they give, and kind of warmed my heart. That's great. Let's have a competition among absurdly rich people on helping others, rather than just buying jets and yachts.
There's certainly nothing wrong with people giving money to causes that they think are valuable. Not every good or service is going to be produced for profit. Some of it can come from this segment of society, and I think it's fine that we recognize that, as long as we don't demonize those who aren't doing it and think that there's something wrong with them pursuing their profits, because there's not. That ultimately makes us better off too.
There are these tycoons from previous years, like Cornelius Vanderbilt and John D. Rockefeller, and people vilify them as robber barons and say, well, they did some charity work, but they were evil robbers.
No, they fundamentally transformed the lives of Americans in the 19th century and raised all of our living standards. Rockefeller brought us oil and made profits in doing it. And by the way, he probably also is responsible for saving the whales, because he pushed down the price of oil so much it was no longer profitable to hunt whales to extinction. Henry Ford comes in and builds automobiles a little bit later and makes them cheaper for people. It didn't matter that his motives was profits. The result was that he made automobiles affordable for average middle-class Americans who had never had an opportunity to do that before. The same is true of most of these so-called robber barons of the late 19th and early 20th century.
Thank you, Ben Powell. Up next.
You ready to freeload?
If I put on a fake beard and beg on the street, will people give me money?
It's a foolish policy, and it will come to an end. The sooner the better.
That's Ron Paul talking about the billions we spend on foreign aid, much of which is squandered or stolen. So I agree with Ron Paul and his son, the senator, that we should stop almost all foreign aid. But when libertarians say that, people get angry.
He wants to cut off American assistance to these nascent democratic efforts. Just turn your back on it. Pull the aid out. What the heck? We give less than 1% of the entire budget of the United States of America.
Actually, it's pretty close to 1%, $35 billion. I say we can't afford that. But Gregory Adams, who runs Oxfam's aid effectiveness program, says we should spend more. Oxfam's a giant charity that tries to fight poverty all over the world. And I say, fine, you want to do that? You raise the money. Leave governments out of it.
Well, the issue, John, is that there are some things that charities just can't do. Despite the impact that Oxfam has around the world, and we're very proud of the work that we do with money raised from average Americans, there's only so much that we can do with our own projects. There's some places where government needs to step in to do things.
All right, government needs to make sure AIDS workers aren't being murdered on the way to where they're going. And I should say that you don't take government money in from the United States, though 30% of your money from some other countries. But you call for governments to spend more on foreign aid. And why, when so much has been squandered?
Well, it's important to note we're calling for more of the right kind of aid.
Yeah, they always say, oh, this is going to be the right kind this time.
No, there are some things that we think the United States government is doing that we think are not a good use of money. In particular, food aid is in desperate need of reform. We lose about half of the value of every dollar that we spend on food aid because we require it to be shipped in American vessels. We're delivering food itself rather than actually buying food at the source and supporting local farmers.
But you also want them to spend more.
Well, we want more of the right kind. There's some very good programs, things like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, that invests in success. It finds the best performing countries rather than subsidizing failure. We want to see more aid given directly to helping small farmers grow more of their own food. And we want to see more aid used to support anti-corruption efforts and good governance efforts in a lot of these countries.
But what are the odds that that'll happen, that the aid supports the corrupt dictators? The New York Times says as much as half the food aid sent to Somalia is diverted to corrupt contractors, Islamic militants, and local UN staff.
Well, Somalia is a really difficult environment.
All right, I'll go on. Zimbabwean authorities confiscated a truck filled with American food aid for school kids, handed it out to supporters of President Robert Mugabe at a political rally.
Again, this is one of the problems when the only tool you have is in-kind food aid, bags of food.
But by calling for more government aid, you're calling for more of the aid that, despite all the promises of reform, has ended up in the hands of corrupt dictators.
Well, we're not just calling for more government aid.
I understand that. Yeah. You do some great work. But why do you call for it at all? You're calling for evil.
There's a lot of misconceptions about U.S. aid. I mean, one of the biggest misconceptions is that most U.S. assistance actually goes to governments. In fact, that's not true. Most U.S. assistance goes to U.S.-based charities, NGOs, and contractors.
And the UN, which sometimes
there's a portion that goes to the UN. We're very clear that the UN is not the solution to poverty, just as aid is not the solution to poverty. People are the solution to poverty.
Let's hear from an actual African entrepreneur. Maguette Wade runs a business in America now, but she tried operating her business in her home country of Senegal. You listen to Greg. You agree? A little combination, foreign aid, government would help?
Well, I have a very hard time with foreign aid. The African Union itself is admitting that $148 billion are being siphoned through corruption every year.
And it goes to Swiss bank accounts.
Swiss bank accounts, fancy real estates in the south of France. The son of the dictator of Equatorial Guinea, for example, ago. He was busted by French customs. His plane was intercepted, and they found in the plane, I think it was 27 fancy cars. I don't know how many, 7 Ferraris, some Bentleys, some Rolls Royces. That's where the aid goes.
I would think the only way to stop that is to say, let's keep governments out of it. If you can get a bunch of people who want to give their own money, they won't give it to dictators.
Well, not all governments are the same, first of all. And we actually work with a lot of anti-corruption and human rights activists in countries around the world who are actually working to try to get their governments to govern more accountably. They're actually interested in the U.S. standing with them and joining this fight. Too often we take such an approach to U.S. assistance. We try to make it, we focus so much on avoiding corruption. These activists are telling us they actually want us to stand with them to fight corruption. And that means that we need to be there standing with them in solidarity, working together with them.
Why do you need government aid?
Why do you need government aid? Because governments are the only tool that can work to solve some of these accountability problems. It's like asking why do the Bears need an offensive line just because the linemen don't score any touchdowns. At some point, you need these other tools. It's going to be entrepreneurs like Maggette who solve the problem of African poverty. But you also need governments to do other things that entrepreneurs can't do.
You need these governments, government aid.
Well, unfortunately, at least in most countries in Africa, government has been the problem. They basically stand in my way. As an entrepreneur, government does nothing but slow me down on a regular basis. There are officials bribing me all along. The fact that my truck gets stopped on a regular basis from point A to point B, making its way from point A to the port, and that I have to pay each single time, and the delays that really,
He says government aid will help fight the corruption.
No, I am sorry. The more you're feeding these huge governments, and the more you're choking me on the other end. And that is at least the phenomenon that I am a witness of and that I have to live through every day. And the more you give to them, and the more that's what happens to me on the ground.
Greg?
But we do think that there is a role that government can play. And in fact, in a lot of the places that Oxfam works, we actually find there's a government deficit because there's a lack of security. There's a lack of basic services. People don't have clean water. People have to deal with. But
why do you believe government aid would provide that? It hasn't so far after trillions were spent.
That's actually not true. There's a lot of success stories going on right now in Africa. There's a lot of African countries that are seeing huge economic growth.
I look forward to seeing them.
Yeah.
Thank you, Greg. Maggette. Coming up, why a man came up to me on the street and said, "You John Stossel?" "Yes." "I hope you die soon." Someone once came up to me on the street here in New York and said, "You John Stossel?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "I hope you die soon." So what was this hatred about? It turned out he was what people call an anti-poverty lawyer, and he did things like suing landlords to stop them from evicting people. And in his world here in New York, capitalism, which I'm for, is the enemy, and the only thing that keeps poor people from being totally oppressed is government. So because I call for less government, I'm evil. In this town, we libertarians are selfish people who don't care about anyone else, especially the poor. And the good guys are called bleeding heart liberals. So what's this website about? Bleeding Heart Libertarians. It talks about social justice and free markets. Georgetown University philosophy professor Jason Brennan regularly contributes to the site. Why? What's this about?
So the idea behind Bleeding Heart Libertarians, I think, is to recapture what was ultimately the soul of libertarianism. What I think libertarians can and should do is embrace the concept of social justice, the idea that if we're going to advocate property rights and other kinds of things.
What's the phrase even mean? I'm so annoyed on campuses. I'm for social justice. Like, so if you're not on their side, you're for social injustice?
Right. You know, for a lot of people, it doesn't mean anything. It just means socialism. But for many people, there is a real meaning. And that is that if you're going to have coercive institutions that you expect other people to live by,
government,
laws, property rights, family rules, anything like that, one of the tests of those institutions should be that you expect when people live by them and abide by them, they'll tend to produce good consequences for everybody, not just for some. And so I think you can show whether you care about this as a libertarian by asking a question like this. Imagine that Marxists were right about markets. Imagine they were a disaster. Imagine that they left the overwhelming majority of people destitute. Would you still advocate markets? Or would you at least have some reservation about it? Yeah. I think most libertarians would say, I'd at least have some reservations. Like, the fact that markets work matters in their justification. And if you think that, then you advocate, whether you know it or not, what philosophers are calling social justice.
Now, Ayn Rand said, I do not consider charity a major virtue or a moral duty. And that's been a big point. She's called selfish.
What she means by selfishness isn't what most people mean. But even if she thinks that, I don't think she speaks for most people. I think most libertarians are humane. They give to charity. They care that markets work and that they work for everybody. So the minimum wage. If you didn't think that it mattered, that it hurt the poor, why would you argue that it causes unemployment? You would just say the minimum wage interferes with economic freedom and that's that. But you don't. You say that the minimum wage causes unemployment among the most vulnerable people in society, and that's part of the reason to oppose it. And that means that you care about the consequences for the poor.
On the website, Bleeding Heart Libertarian, this is categories like advocating versus caring versus helping.
Yeah. I think this explains what's going on with people when they think that libertarians are selfish. If you're on the left, you probably believe that your policies are the only sensible expression of benevolence. And so you probably think if libertarians disagree with your policies, they must disagree with your values. They must only care about their pocketbooks. That doesn't really make sense. One, because we have real arguments about why we think their policies don't work, but also advocacy is cheap. If I advocate that we have a 90% marginal tax rate on all income over $100,000, if I advocate that doesn't cost me anything. If I give money to charity,
and
that
is what the left does.
Yeah.
Government should have a bigger anti-poverty program.
Right. That costs you nothing, but you get the warm glow of altruism when you say you advocate that. Genuine caring, you know when you care when you put your money where your mouth is, because it actually costs you something. So if you're giving 10% of your income away, I know you're concerned. If you're just advocating taking 10% of income from other people or yourself, and that's all you do, you're not really showing me that you really care.
It's easy to be generous with other people's money.
Yeah.
That's what politicians do.
That's right.
Thank you. Coming up, my take on real charity. When it comes to charity, I used to be pretty cheap. My mom told me, if you don't save your money, you'll freeze in the dark. So I saved. But when my career took off and I started getting paid money to make speeches, I decided to donate that money to charity, and it changed my life. I realized I like giving money away. It makes me happy. And research on what makes people happy backs that up. On average, people who give to charity, whether they give in money or just time, they're happier. So give. It's good for us and good for them. Though that depends whom you give to.
You ready to freeload?
I put on a fake beard and tried begging in New York City.
You help me, man?
People gave me money. They gave me money when my cardboard sign said homeless and cold, and they even gave when I changed it to need a beer.
Thank you.
No, my beer drinker myself.
Yeah, thank you.
When we asked givers why they gave, people said things like this.
I don't know, that guy looked pretty needy, I suppose.
I just begged for an hour, but I did well. If I did this for an 8-hour day, I would have made $90. $23,000 for a year. Tax-free. That's the reason social workers say don't give to beggars. Often it's a scam, and very often you're an enabler. By giving cash, you subsidize the beggar's drug or alcohol habit. By not giving, you may encourage them to get real help. A few respectable charities solicit on the street, like the people who collect for the Salvation Army before Christmas, but most who beg in public are running scams.
I need your help. I am homeless. Will you help me out today?
New York's Attorney General said this pitch from a group calling itself United Homeless is a scam. Its director keeps nearly all the money, spends it on things like his Weight Watcher bills.
How is it a scam?
I hear you keep most of the money.
Well, we're homeless people that work the tables, correct?
Well, but the pitch is it's going to shelters, it's going to food kitchens.
The director has bills. Do you have bills? What, are you supposed to run a non-profit organization and not get no money?
All the people donating this drug absolutely knows where that money goes.
It's hard to find out where your charity money really goes. We can check charity rating services like Charity Navigator. It's better than nothing. But the ratings aren't perfect. Some charities aren't rated, and rating services, they sometimes get conned too. So I give my charity money to groups that I can check out myself, like the Doe Fund, a group that rehabs ex-cons and addicts. I decided they do a good job because I could see these men. They call them men in blue, ready, willing, and able. They clean up New York City streets. And what was odd is that they do it with spring in their step. They look cheerful, and they work pretty fast. I thought who's ever working with these guys has done something right, taught them to take pride in work. So I give them money, and a couple other groups that I can watch. But while I give to what I think are good charities, and this is the season for giving, we shouldn't forget that the people who do the most for the poor are capitalists. Honest ones, not the ones who feed off government. But job creators do much more good for the world than politicians, and more even than the do-gooders working for charities. I'm delighted that the singer Bono figured that out after spending years calling for governments to spend more in foreign aid. Now he says the best hope for the poor, free markets.
Rockstar preaches capitalism. Wow. Sometimes I hear myself and I just can't believe it. But commerce is real. Aid is just a stopgap. Commerce, entrepreneurial capitalism takes more people out of poverty than aid. Of course we know that.
Politicians don't know that. Many Americans don't know it. It's time they learn. Bono's right. Entrepreneurial capitalism takes more people out of poverty than aid ever will. That's our show. See you next week.